Welcome back to Proxam, everybody. And today I have Taxi with me, and he wants to talk a little bit about his ideas about how to make 40K more lore friendly with the rules. How you doing today, Taxi?
Hey, doing great, Proxy. How's it going?
Pretty good, man. I was listening to some of what you were talking about on the Discord, and it really piqued my interest because I feel like in 10th edition, as far as the balance goes, I know the direction GW is going with it, but it has taken away a little bit of something from the lore and the way that people want to play their armies, or when they get into the faction, feel like the army should play. And I feel like 10th edition has kind of taken some of that away. And you had some ideas about how to kind of bring back that lore friendly side of the game in ways that could also empower the player when they're playing their regular 40K games at their local game store. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I think that we've kind of run into a little bit of an issue where certain types of like data sheets are like repeats of very similar abilities. A good example is like the Space Marine Captain and the Chaos Lord, both having sort of the same damage steroid, sticky objectives, things like this. Things that almost should be universal special rules, and yet we wind up having sort of the 8th and ninth edition problem of, hey, we have all these different rules with different names for every army, with basically the same text, but it just winds up being like it feels very like cut and paste instead of being an ability that's very in line with faction identity. And I think that there have been, in addition, several misses on faction army rules. One that comes to mind that I'm sure you might agree with is Tau have this for the greater good ability, which I think is ideally supposed to work like a sniper team. You have a spotter and you have the unit that is shooting. But it's almost sort of a trap. And it's very clunky to use because what ends up happening is even if there are situations where it does work out to be better, you're essentially trading the shooting activation of a unit um, for additional ballistic skill, and I think that sort of a feels bad. And I think we've had really huge winners, like obviously Chaos Space Marines. Everyone looks at them with envy of, hey, you have this really cool, flavorful ability that is also very effective mechanically. And so I have since sort of toned down the scope of that. So I'm thinking maybe I'll start with like a couple data sheets for each army and go from there and see how people react to it rather than sort of front loading a bunch of effort and having it not work out.
Right. And that definitely makes sense. I mean, you're absolutely correct with the army misses, because there's been so many armies that I've seen, at least from my buddies from ninth edition to 10th edition, that have been just disappointed with the results. Like, I recently had somebody, I mean, this is over a year ago now, but when 10th edition came out, there was a guy in our group who also played Eldar, and he was a big Uthway fan. And he had his, guardians and everything. He didn't play to be competitive or anything like that, but he just liked running his Uthway army. He liked his Storm Guardians, even though, I mean, what can you say? I love them too, but they weren't that good in ninth edition, you know? Um, and he was completely thrown a loop when 10th edition came out, and he realized that he couldn't really play the faction that he loved with the same level of lore friendliness as before, you know? And he ended up leaving a couple months later when he was just like, yeah, I'm just not into it. I'm going to come back when the rules are more lore friendly, when I can play my Uthway like Uthway, They bring back something like psychic powers, and that's kind of where it was at. And a lot of people have this, kind of feeling about the game that it's kind of coming away from how it should play in the lore. And I'm not saying that lore should be all, but there should be a link to it at least, no?
Yeah, and I think like in the case of like your friend in his Uthway list, um, And I agree with that, because what ends up happening is that even if the viability of the unit is like quote unquote overall better in the like for Eldar, like building a balanced list, it does take away from some of that theming, and this kind of ties into like sub factions versus detachments. Detachments, I think, are often they're slightly too specific. You are constantly feeling like you wish your detachment affected like one or two more things. And this is sort of like the keyword soup problem that GW has with a lot of its games, where it's like they're usually a little bit too stingy with it. And you see this especially in like early ninth edition codexes, like Necrons, where they said, okay, we're gonna have this new system. It's gonna be core. It's what's gonna separate our troops and like buffing everything, and like so we don't have too many buffs going around. And then they immediately release Space Marines, and like everything that is a Space Marine, dreadnoughts have core. And it was a little ridiculous. Even if that faction didn't wind up being like powerful, it's the fact that it often feels like not everyone on the design team is getting the same like rule book in terms of like how design principles for the edition. Psychic is another great example because what you see a lot of times is like in the case of warlocks or the chaos sorcerer, in like power armor, the one in Terminator armor is okay. But what you see constantly with these units is that you get like one really bad ability, and that the unit is basically just unplayable. And it's like even if like uh yeah, on paper the chaos sorcerer -1 to hit is okay, it has to compete against stuff like the Chaos Lord, discounting stratagems by one. Um, and you really just like you it's almost like we've sacrificed variety on the altar of hyperbalance. And I've seen this happen with a lot of fighting games, where if you go back like say like 20 years, to like 2000, 2004, if you like actually take apart a lot of these games, they are fundamentally broken. But because people didn't have the same like nuts and bolts mindset of how can I abuse this game as hard as I can, and it's like a big cultural shift that has made it harder to design things because people care primarily about being good at the thing, the game. I want to be the best.
Right.
um and I think that competitive has its place, but I think that Warhammer is not a game you can design around the 1%. And I think that there are a lot of things you can do to fix this. For example, the reason we didn't have this with Psychic previously, was because you ended up having like all of the Psychers in your army for the most part, unless you were an army with like multiple tables. You had 6 different powers. You were likely to have one or two or three of those things that were like usable, especially if you were in like a psychic heavy army and you had access to 2 tables like Eldar or Thousand Sons, um, where you had like the different Warlock and Farseer tables for ninth edition. And I think we've lost some of like the fun utility, like the Psychic Awakening. I'm going to take the Sunreaver bike. That like it's a enhancement that makes you move super duper fast. You're going to move up, cast Psychic Ritual, cast Quicken, which gives you a second movement activation, and just move back. Um, and it's funny to me how like that sounds really broken in theory, but when everyone else can kind of do it, it's not so bad.
Yeah, well, I remember in ninth edition that was like the only thing we could do to stay on top of the secondary objective game, man. Like it was hard playing Eldar in ninth edition competitively, but I think the thing that made it fun for me was I didn't care so much if, I brought my army to a tournament and it was gonna like smash the tournament. That wasn't the big deal. It was how can I make this army effective for what I want it to do, you know?
Hmm.
And if it succeeds in that goal, then it's a success and it's a fun thing to do. And I mean, to a degree that you can still do the same thing in 10th edition, but not to the extent that you could in ninth with all the special, rules and how you could specifically tailor your army to certain things, you know?
Yeah, and I posted in the Discord, one of the the great examples, right, is instead of having these like sort of weird filler abilities, and a perfect example of this is if you look in Death Guard under their cultists, they don't even have a data sheet ability. Instead, they have Scouts 6. It's just a universal special rule that for an army with very little movement, um has this extra little advantage. And I think there's a lot of like ways you can do that where not everything necessarily has to have a super like unique ability or one of these like copy paste abilities. Another one is I posted was a Trader Guardsman. Currently they're 70 points a model. They have the infantry squad ability from the Astra Militarum index, which is the gain the benefit of cover while in range of an objective. And that's good. Um, but it's like you could almost make them more expensive, give them a better ability that is more in line with like what they do, because it's like, hey, you have traders on this world who have like inherent knowledge of the terrain and like the forces, and you could give them something like the infiltrate special rule, which is also interesting because Chaos Space Marines does not have an inherent infiltrator
Right.
unless they ally in Nurglings, which um, is its own problem.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that'd be a great idea. And I think, when you mentioned that in the Discord, I immediately thought that was a good idea because one, it makes sense lore wise. You know, Trader Guardsmen are going to be infiltrating, the loyalist side anyway. So it makes sense that they would have something like infiltrate, the ability to kind of get closer to the enemy without them realizing it. And two, it solves a game mechanic problem with Chaos that they need to take a specific detachment to be able to infiltrate their units. And it's like, why can't every detachment do that?
Yeah.
It doesn't make
Um,
sense.
Yeah, and I was gonna say it's also lore friendly because where I actually took this from was the old third edition Eye of Terror Codex, and all of the Trader Guardsman units they just come in like the little 10-man blocks. Um, and what was interesting is they also give you another cute little rule break that is under the Army Special Rules. That is, for each unit of traders, you can include one of the Astra Militarum tanks or
Hmm.
other units. Um, and so I think that something that GW needs to do more that they used to be very unafraid of, but because of like people abusing soup in I believe sixth edition and seventh edition were like the huge offenders. Um,
Yeah.
but GW has kind of gotten a little shy of this because they don't want to get caught with their hands in the cookie jar getting too creative. Um, and it's like you had these really cool rule breaks. Like another great one is Iron Warriors in the second, third edition codex could take the Basilisk um from the Astra, and it still had like the you hit on a 4 plus because you were ballistic skill 3 plus or ballistic skill 3
Hmm.
because we're both old and we know that you didn't used to have like a
Fixed hit
raw to
rolls.
hit chance.
Yeah.
Yep. And that was really cool because it's you got all of these like it also meant you had the most indirect of any army because you could take potentially like two defilers and a bunch of basilisks.
Yeah,
And so
that's
that was
right.
such a
Yeah. That was cool. Yeah, I knew a guy who had a full-on, beautifully painted Trader Guard army back then. And I
yeah.
remember at some point he stopped coming around the shop and I asked, "Oh, what happened to him?" And they were like, "Well, he quit because they made his army became literally illegal overnight and he really didn't want to play loyalist guardsmen."
Yeah.
So
I
it's
and I
just
totally
like,
get that.
oh man, and it's like it brings me back to times when I've felt like leaving the hobby when a big rule shift comes by, or like even just quitting playing an army. Like in fifth edition, Dark Eldar came out, and everybody was playing the meta Raider spam, Venom spam lists, but I didn't really care for that type of play style. So what I did was I had a webway portal army that would be basically, and if you guys don't know out there listening, if you guys don't know what this army did, you basically deployed a 3-inch blast marker. One of your characters threw it out within, it had to touch its base or whatever, but you put it out there. And then when your units came in from reserve, instead of coming in from the sides of the board, you could come in from the circle. So it was like you're deploying this hole in the webway that your Dark Eldar can just fucking come out of and destroy things. So you could take 2 of these in your army. And so I'd set these up on the battlefield, and then your opponent doesn't know what the hell to do. They're like, do I block this one off, and then they come over, they come out of this one, or it was just crazy shit. And you had to roll back then to see which units came in. So it was literally a different game every time, depending on what units actually came into the board. So it was a great experience. And it was super fun. Maybe not super competitive, but it was so fun and it threw people off and it was great. And then in 6th edition, they literally made a rule that you couldn't do that anymore. You had to only put, I think it was like 25% of your army in reserve. So you had to start out with most of your army on the table. And that just completely destroyed the whole list. So it's like, damn, you know, do I spend $300 more to buy a bunch of raiders for my army to make sure that they're protected against ranged, or do I just say fuck it and just scrap the project, right? So a lot of people have this feeling when they create they have these creative kind of armies that they put their heart and souls into, and then GW turns around and says, actually, nah, we're gonna change everything up. So it feels bad for sure.
And it is one. Speaking of the webway thing, that kind of reminds me of a Warhammer Fantasy thing of the old Gotrek and Felix rules when you would field them. I forget exactly how many points. They were like an absurd number of points, but they were both broken.
Hmm.
I believe they had to come in via the like a similar reserve style rule. Um, and then there was just a chance that they could just fuck off in the middle of the game. Like you would roll like reserve, you'd keep rolling reserve rolls, and it got more and more likely that like a twist of fate would just like sweep them up into a different adventure, and they would just leave you hanging when you spent like 600 points on them.
Oh my god, that's great.
Yeah,
That's
it's
so
it's
good.
awesome. And I miss little things like that where it's like, yeah, is this competitive? Hell no. But is that funny? Oh yeah. Um, and so I feel like there you just sort of need to accept that this is a game that it's okay to be a little silly, and it's okay to be a little inconsistent. I mean, even if you look as modern as like AOS Slaves to Darkness, right? They're a casino army. Their whole shtick is that you do things successfully in the game, whether it's taking an objective. I don't know if it's like taking an enemy banner. I might be crossing that with the Chaos Warriors Arcane Journal from Old World. But basically just playing the game successfully, and you roll on a table with all these like crazy like stat boost effects. And getting the right ones can really like snowball the game. It's absurd.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that they shouldn't be afraid of inconsistency, just because like sweaty gamer 616 is like raging on the forums. Not that people use forums anymore, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Because oh my god, it was like turn 3 and my XYZ ability rolled a 3 and I failed it. This game is unplayable, and like meanwhile, like if you look at turn 1 and 2, he's like shit stomped his opponent. Um, just people love to complain regardless. So I feel like don't make that a limiting factor, except for us because we're right.
Of
uh,
course.
yeah. Um, but like a good example is but yes, like psychic. No, and like yeah, you run into a lot of these like I was saying, the detachments where it's just oh yeah, like you did it, you just constantly feel like it's not affecting the things you want. Or you think you can pull off a cool combo and it turns out that oh yeah, they changed this model to not have like this keyword, so it doesn't work.
Right.
Um, and it's like you have this like really great blessing of like the game is patchable. And I think we see this in like modern day video games too a little bit, where it's like devs are sometimes a little bit too patch happy,
Yeah.
where it's like there's a quote unquote problem, but if you just let it go a little bit longer, people would adapt. Um, and I think that we've created a culture where people depend on the devs to problem solve for them. And I think that there are often some very loud people in social media and who produce like content for 40K who oftentimes like and competitive players do this in all sorts of games, whether it be like MOBAs or fighting games. They're frustrated about something, they say a hot take, and then a bunch of people in like Twitch chat or YouTube chat go, "Oh yeah, you're so right," and then they go to their like local game store and like parrot all of that information brainlessly,
Hmm.
and it perpetuates itself like endlessly,
Yeah.
even though like the other person, the original source, was being hyperbolic. And then you run into these people who like play the game, they're okay, and just want to repeat XYZ win rates because they heard failing to think of their name, like Art of War, or like a channel like that,
Right.
40K dirtbags, and we're all guilty of this too.
Oh,
um
absolutely.
Like,
Absolutely.
don't get me wrong, I love my 40K dirtbags. But like even I can say accursed cultists were a problem. I'm still sad and think they got slightly over nerfed, but
Hmm.
whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like what happened to Orcs initially, right? They had this huge win
Mhm.
rate because they were anti-meta in a lot of ways, if you think about it. Um, and people were not able to deal with the Mega Knob spam or the Orc Boy spam or whatever it was. And there was adaptions. I mean, I made a couple of videos where I was like, "Hey guys, Wind Riders, they absolutely wreck Orc Boys. Like, no problem. You will table an Orc army like this if you just put a unit of Wind Riders, a big unit of Wind Riders in your army." And then, GW comes through and just with the Nerf hammer just slaps the Orcs down from like the top spot in the game to the absolute dregs, the bottom three. Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you take a faction that is the top dog and you nerf them so hard that they're now on the bottom? There's definitely like some overcorrections happening in the game because of the noise that surrounds, and the complaints that surround some of these armies. Because you're right, people just don't want to deal with it. They're just rather have GW fix it, you know?
Yeah, and I think this is like, and don't get me wrong, like I'm biased as hell, but I think that like if there's an army that should be top tier and should be left to like for players to problem solve, an army that is honest like orcs, where it has to take inherent more risks and like very traditionally have going second into like shooting problems, that's kind of a problem that's going to like sort itself out. Another big thing is, like you said, because the meta was so elite at the time, people weren't teching to deal with like green tide. I think that like the mega knobs were oppressive, but it was really more a problem of like their rules.
Hmm.
But and so this has happened a couple times where it's GW will points nerf something and rules nerf something at the same time, and it'll be like a huge points nerf. Like I forget if it was the same balance data slate or not, but like they did the same thing to like warp talents that they just did to Accursed Cultist. And it's like you didn't learn your lesson the first time, old man. Uh, how did you manage to like nerf this thing 30 points because it was high pick rate? And I think that's what it is too, is that GW um has this thing where they like look at zoomed out stats a lot of the time. And they don't put them in like the context of like sample size.
Hmm.
And it causes a lot of problems.
Right.
A great example is like, so the people who were running the Accursed Cultist spam. It was the people running it for the cultist detachment, Chaos Cults. There were like two people winning all the tournaments. Mostly one guy from 40K Dirtbags. And the other one was just recently an Australian who took some big tournament down there. I'm not as knowledgeable about the different events. But I was tracking a lot of that detachment in particular. But what also happened is you had people in Renegade Raiders, which is just like all of your units get assault. It's a big generic benefit, big mobility boost, and they get AP boost on objectives. And that detachment was running the Accursed Cultist brick, like three of them, because it was too good. But what has happened now is that by buffing all of these other units, and by nerfing the Accursed Cultist brick into the ground like this, what has happened is they've actually rewarded Renegade Raiders, um, because they're the ones who have the more generic benefits to their detachment, so that they can target more things, whereas the Cultist detachment is locked to specifically affecting damned units, like the Accursed Cultists. For which like that was their big like all-star player. And this is something that you run into with the detachment design all the time, where while yes, on paper, if this was like League of Legends or something, and that all of these characters existed in a vacuum, um, that would be a great change. But because you have these different like skill sets or these different like rule sets that are all like interconnected, um, when Renegade Raiders was the much larger sample size of the problem of people like abusing a cursed cultist like durability. It's the Chaos Cult players who are playing their ass off to make this like meme detachment work. Uh is a little frustrating. Um and it's like I've even watched like the VOD of a couple of the tournaments where it's they sit there and explain, hey, you need to like watch out for like howling hordes, because what happens is when you shoot at me, I can remove models first, and that changes the quote unquote closest unit that I can then make the movement go towards, and potentially deny you activations. So you have to be really careful about like your order of operations here. And the person's just like thumbing through like their cheat sheets and going, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. And then like, whoa, lo and behold, a surprised Pikachu face when they're like, you can do that? It's like, yes. Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Um, so it's like I do feel like there are a lot of scenarios in which your opponent has to put forth an honest effort, and if they don't, you should not be villainized or vilified for your opponent's subpar performance.
Yeah, and I mean, you as the player have to put a lot of thought, positioning, care, planning into actually putting yourself into a position where your opponent has that dilemma in the first place.
Exactly. Like
So,
you're
like, why
I'm
am I getting
sitting here.
punished for that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sitting here doing advanced geometry, and they're mashing the square peg into the star hole, and but I'm the bad guy.
Yeah, no, that's often the case with high skill cap armies, and I think Chaos is one of those armies. And I think that's why you continue to see them be effective, even though for the most part, their win rate isn't anything spectacular, you know? But you do see people running them consistently and winning big events with them. And it's like, why is that? Because it's very high skill cap. And when you put that much time into an army like that, you're going to be rewarded for it, you know?
And I think that's like half true, because I mean like CSM has its brain dead detachments.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
And that's like Renegade Raiders, like the one that Reddit is so very clearly in love with, and then
Hmm.
people are like, "What do you mean I can't just run like XYZ?" Um and there's like a couple other like little things, but not to get too specific. But yeah, and it is there's like all these like I don't want to sit here and have the take of, oh, just don't be competitive. Like, obviously, that's not the answer. But I think that there is like a you have to sort of meet us halfway because there is sort of a problem where the top end does dictate so much of the balance of the game, and it's like companies that try to force an esport, right? Like Warhammer by its very nature is a very like swingy game.
Hmm.
um we could sit here and play right now and you could make every right decision and you could roll all ones and I could roll all sixes. Like that is not a premise for a skill-based game. And obviously there are a lot of ways to like manipulate rolls and like play through bad dice. Um but at the end of the day, like this is a slot machine. There just are ways to control the outcome.
Yeah, true.
Um and I'm sorry, we got so like involved in like mechanics. But yeah, so it's like I am kind of like starting up a project of just wanting to like I wouldn't say like correct, but like to just sort of try some alternative designs for some of the more like stinker data sheets. And just sort of make them publicly available for people's like local group to just like, hey, try out my homebrew variation of these units. And I feel like this is something that used to be done a lot more. If you look at like war games historically, um, it's like if it or even like Dungeons and Dragons, Chainmail, like all these sorts of things where it's like no one in like the TTRPG circles, I think for the most part, plays rules exactly as written. And I think that we need to realize that GW are not infallible gods of game design. It's just that they have the most resources, and it's quite literally their job. And I think that we need to open the door for people to have their own fan made design compete with like GW. And
Hmm.
because that's how a lot of things get done in other games, like Magic the Gathering. EDH was literally like a fan made. For those of you that don't know, EDH is Elder Dragon Highlander, which is a good way to make like a bunch of like it's you could think like Yu-Gi-Oh, you have a deck master, and you only have like one of cards in your deck. And so it's like when you compare that to like the base game, it creates this interesting new situation where a lot of other units are useful in ways that they wouldn't have been before. And I think we need to bring back sort of that experimental spark with wargaming. And I think that the Warhammer community is one of the worst games communities when it comes to deviating from original design. And I think that we need to normalize having some of these, I wouldn't even say so much narrative, but some of these more like fun, I wouldn't even say it's casual, but just to deviate from Daddy GW says so and just try your own hand at sort of messing with some homebrew and like throwing numbers at the wall. And I think as long as you are semi like generous to like from your opponent's perspective of like I wouldn't want to play against this. This is broken. This is an auto take. Um and I mean, like, you're gonna run into people who are gonna try to like slide that stuff like past people and be like, no, no, this is balanced. You can do like X, Y, and Z. And it's like such a specific thing that it really doesn't matter. Um, but I think there's a lot of like play in trying to bring back like raid missions from third edition or like night fight. Creating like some of these more interesting like mission types that are not just, hey, I'm gonna stand on these corners and spend my shooting activation to uh, like do this. And I think missions are a great place to start that. And also like the bad data sheets. I would love to see people show me your chaos sorcerer. Like I'm not saying we need to rewrite 10th edition, but even to just like give me your own take on what's like a really bad or meh Eldar unit that just doesn't get played right now.
Shadows here. Hemlock
Yeah,
Roughwood. Yeah, there's a few.
yeah, well, yeah, but flyers in general, like maybe we need to like play with that a little bit. Like maybe we just default everything to having hover. Um, you
Yeah,
know.
perhaps, or just some other kind of benefit that flyers get. Because they used to have -1 to hit. They used to have like other cool things, but
Oh yeah, like jinx saves, all
yeah,
sorts of crazy stuff like that. Yeah. Didn't they used to be like I remember this happening with Eldar skimmers where it's like, "Oh yeah, you just hit on sixes. Fuck you."
yeah, that was so. The history of Eldar skimmers is so funny. So in fourth edition, if you made it into combat with an Eldar skimmer who moved at least 12 inches, which they always were, you needed to hit on sixes.
That's what it was.
Yeah,
Um, I remember because like I would try to like charge in my blood claws, because that was I played Space Wolves in third edition, and I lived in eternal envy of another person at the store who had like a Lost in the Damned style army, and I think I only played with that person once, and it's like that they're and it wasn't even like super well painted. It was just like spiky rust and like spiky guardsmen, and I was just like, oh, so cool. um and I think that like yeah, like the Eye of Terror is like a perfect example of something that is supplementary to that. And it's like you have I I almost feel like we need to sort of play around with like homebrew army lists, like different like rules breaks for like souping. And
absolutely.
that's like a good way to get your feet wet. As
Yeah,
long as it is like narrative friendly and you're not just like, ah yes, my ultramarine librarians are summoning corn demons. I mean like maybe you have like a captain that went traitor and you could do it for like a narrative thing, but I think in general try to err on the side of like making it make sense, right? And don't just like play for power or like
yeah.
combos.
Like armies of renown, like what
Yep.
fantasy old world is doing with their what do they call them? What are the new books
Arcane
called?
journals.
Arcane journals, yeah. And
Yep.
you end up with a really flavorful army that you have to play in a certain way, but you get some really cool bonuses that actually make it good. Like I was looking through the Dwarf Arcane Journal the other day, and the Expeditionary Force is awesome. You actually do want to run Thunders in that list, whereas you usually wouldn't run them. You know?
Or you get dwarves with spears.
Yes, the Imperial Dwarves. I mean, I always wanted dwarves with spears when I started playing Warhammer Fantasy because they're very defensive, but I could never afford the old, dwarf with Imperial Dwarf models because they were super expensive at that time because they're out of production. But yeah, it's really cool. It's a cool idea, and
And
they've done a good
I
job with
think
that.
yeah, and I honestly feel like while the freedom of expression in 10th edition on paper seems great because there's no force organization chart to tell you to stop being a naughty boy and to build your army right. I think that there's a lot of situations in which limitations breed creativity, and that is like a principle of design that because we had these limitations, the exceptions to the rule felt so much better. I don't know if this will make a whole lot of sense to any of you out there. A perfect example is Saints Row 2 versus Saints Row 3. Saints Row 3 is a game where it's a lot of like progression gating. You have to like play mini games and work for a lot of things. It's a lot like GTA. um, in the third game, they just give you like a helicopter and all this stuff out of the gate, and it feels less special because it's not earned. In some ways, having more restrictions is better because then when you put in the effort or you are rewarded with the carrot, it like strangely is like more fun. Um, it's difficult to explain. Or I had like a good WoW analogy too, but I'm absolutely blanking on what that is. Oh well.
Well, it'd be like when WoW first started, right? Classic, vanilla WoW versus WoW today, right? They didn't give you much back then. I remember I started playing WoW when it first came out, and you had to work for everything you got. You had to work for a mount. You had to work for, cool weapons and items. If you wanted a PvP and you wanted some, PvP enchants or gear, stuff like that, you had to grind it out. And nowadays, it's much easier to get. You get max level 80 right away, max level 85, whatever it is now, pretty much boosted up to whatever level you need to be boosted to. And, you can pretty much just start playing endgame right out of the gate.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it, right? Is that there's less of an appreciation for like the quote unquote grind. Um, and I feel like game designers are afraid to create restrictions because they will lose new players. And if you look at something like Old World, it is not, I wouldn't say it's like a hugely popular game. I mean, there's a lot more people than I would have thought for sure. Um, but it is very like it is traditional, but it has so much soul to it. Um, and it's like when you really break down a lot of the missions in that game, it really just boils down to kill more things than your opponent, and get less of your things killed. And what's interesting about that, that second part there, is that in war games, we often tokenize soldiers as a way to like get points. Like I'm going to have my Eldar Guardians run forward onto this center objective. They'll get killed in return, but I'm going to score command points, or I'm going to score points for the primary, um and that's going to like in like lore wise that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, there are like you could like say like, oh well, the thing there is so valuable that it is worth 10 Eldar lives. um but I think that it is like a little bit of like reaching sometimes, and I think that having incentives to keep your units alive, beyond just like, oh yes, you earn more points by staying on the point and staying alive, um it is like obvious, right? It's like king of the hill in any shooter ever.
Hmm.
um
Absolutely.
and so like as a result, it sort of creates a situation where in sometimes you might even be better conceding some points for the reward of keeping your guys alive. And I think that's sort of like an interesting point too, is just like it then you feel more like a general who has to deal with like the efficacy of human or Eldar life, as the case may be. Um, and trying to preserve, and I feel like that could be an interesting like mission unto itself, or interesting rule unto itself. Like having like debuffs applied to an army based on like a, well, maybe that's not a great idea because that kind of turns into a snowball situation of like, I was going to say having debuffs placed on how much of your army has been killed, but I again like that's going to run into the situation of I got charged turn one by orcs. How do I fight now that I've been debuffed? So yeah, maybe
Yeah.
not.
Well, maybe not a
Um,
debuff, but like a penalty to your victory points at the end of the game, right?
yeah, and I feel like that, so it kind of creates an interesting niche for being elite, and then you can sort of like increase the points cost of elite armies further because then they have this niche of simply by staying alive more easily and having access to a better defensive profile. Um, I am like a better unit, and therefore, even without increasing their numbers in any way, you've increased their usefulness. Or in the opposite way, you could decrease the value of horde units who are going to give up their points costs very naturally by having like a 5+6+ save. Um, and I think that GW also needs to learn to be a little bit more experimental with units. A great example, it obviously conscripts. I forget, to Eldar have something like that that was very much like a counts as.
Like, did we? I
I
don't.
know that, like, for example, in Ulthway, you had the
Black
seer console
Guardians,
that
sure.
you well. Or there's like a seer console that attached to the avatar of Cain in Eye of Terror. It was like a
Oh
weird.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, it was two warlocks and I think a farseer, if I'm not
And
mistaken.
I think you could just add additional units to it in the same way that you could. But that's like interesting because now you have like the play of having this monster that is surrounded by psychers. They're part of the same unit, so you can take the hits on the avatar of Cain, and it almost becomes like a shield. I also think it's so weird that like there isn't a seer council anymore for Eldar. That's such a flavor loss in the same way that like um Imperial Guard infantry is like you have all of these like very different cultures and each of them is like its own data sheet instead of just having an infantry platoon having a generic profile and then having detachments based on like those regiments.
Right. Yeah, I
Um,
actually think that the way they're going with the guard by making separate data sheets for Cadians, separate data sheets for Catachans and all that, I don't really think that's the right way to go about it personally, but you know, that's what it is.
and yeah, I agree. I think a man with a rifle should be a man with a rifle. You create generic benefits that the army gets, but I think that it is and it feels like a stretch. Like they're having to figure out, well, we need to figure out something with guard, and they're afraid to go back to those roots. And I feel like this is something that a lot of games need to do is go back to what was successful. And like whenever you start feeling like your game or whatever is out of touch with what it used to be, it's important to go back to that setting Bible and or like previous editions and figure out what made those things work. A perfect analogy for this is what I was thinking of. The perfect analogy is in World of Warcraft there was an expansion called Legion. And what they did is they figured out a lot of classes became really homogenized. A lot of classes had like a self heal and like they could all do each other's job. With like the obvious caveat of like certain classes like still couldn't heal or tank or what have you. Um, but what ended up happening is in Legion, they essentially took a lot of the classes and they went back to like the drawing board. What makes a warlock a warlock? Well, a warlock wants to do direct damage and siphon life and spend their own life to get all these things. And so what they did is they sort of recontextualize a lot of abilities and adopted a less is more sort of like thought process. Um, because when all of these armies can do some of the same things and they feel very similar, you lose what makes them special.
Hmm.
Um, Whether that be conscripts or the seer console or psychic. Even though 10th edition is more balanced, it does so in a way that sacrifices the identity of these factions. And I think that that is a tremendous loss for not only the players, but the setting of Warhammer 40,000.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, I found that 10th edition is a much more balanced experience game-wise, but on the other hand, I'm looking at the data sheets and I'm looking at something like Swooping Hawks and I see five or six other units from other armies that can do the same exact thing. And I'm like, okay, you know.
And that's the thing too, is like Swooping Hawks used to be like we are the jump infantry that drop down, shoot, and jump back up. And while that did sometimes feel uninteractive as a Marine player or what have you, where they would move up a bunch of stuff, shoot it, and then pop down with the Hawks and finish you off, and then because they managed to get the killing blow, jump back up. And there weren't things like Overwatch or what have you. Um, but it's that was something that only that unit could do. I think that also GW has sort of heirloom weaponed a lot of units into like only doing a not being able to specialize into doing anything really well. And you see this with like a lot of units. It's like, oh well, they can only take one of each weapon. And I've heard different stories on this. I don't know if GW lost some sort of like suit because like not all of the kits come with the things that they can build in the unit. I remember something vaguely about that, but I've heard a lot of people say it is or it isn't. So I don't know what's actually true there. I don't know like European law. Um, but I think that there's like there has to be some sort of like better solution beyond like none of your units can specialize. Even if you think of like the like idea of a real military, right? Like you have a squad that is going to do a job. They have to be able to be equipped to do that job. You don't like if you have a sniper team, you're not going to give them a flamethrower. That's stupid.
Right. No, I
Um
totally agree. And I think, specifically with the Imperial Guard, one of the biggest losses to me was the special weapon squads, you know? And were they competitive? No, but they were cool and it made sense why you would have a team like that, you know? So,
and
unfortunate.
I think they still were useful because what ended up happening was like you could take the minimum infantry squad requirement of like I believe it was like two squads per like infantry platoon, quote unquote,
Hmm.
and then just like load up on the special weapons. And so like in like fifth edition, for example, you had like the very rudimentary introduction of Overwatch. Or maybe that was like early sixth.
It was sixth
Um
edition, yeah.
Okay. Because I and funny you bring up your Dark Eldar because I very much did hop on the bandwagon for like trying out witches and they were really broken in fifth and then the rules for Overwatch got introduced and my Imperial Guard buddy very suspiciously started having a bunch of like squads with four flamers in front of everything else and I'm like, well, I guess I'll die.
Yeah, and absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons I also was like, do I really want to continue this army now with, and I mean, terrain rules weren't like they were today. It's not like you could field an army and it would survive past turn one if you didn't roll the first turn, you know? Very different
And
landscape.
yeah, and I do think that that is something to consider, right? Is and I'm not some 40K boomer. There's a lot of like modern sensibilities of like new 40K that even as someone who played in like third through fifth edition, oop, my computer's going to sleep. There we go. Even as someone who played like third and fifth edition, um there you run into uh like people talking about like, oh, blast templates were so cool, and I'm like, no, it wasn't. Ever since like they started doing like size creep, and then you have like the bigger terminators, you center it over one, you literally can't hit more than one, or you get like three partials, and then everyone wants to argue everything ever down to a partial.
Hmm.
So and what ends up happening is like keywords like blast actually end up being more consistent. And I don't feel like that is that big of a loss because 40K is a game where it's like you have like your unit coherency, everything's within 2 inches of each other. So like a blast doesn't work. Blast templates work in like old world and Warhammer Fantasy because things are incentivized to be ranked up like that.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely agree. Yeah.
so it works there. Um, like large blast was kind of like the same thing because it's like you couldn't get like the center reliably. And it's like lots of like little things, right? Where it's like blast creates a even though it is more like quote unquote generic, it solves a problem of you don't run into people like arguing that type of like partial scenario. Um Another really big one is vehicles going to toughness. Um a lot of people are like, "Oh man, armor value was so great." What ended up happening is that either you would get someone who got really lucky with like anti-tank, and blow up your thing first turn because like your vehicle essentially had one wound,
Hmm.
if they got like good enough on the vehicle damage table, or the opponent like either would get unlucky or just not have an answer to it. Um, I mean, even like the hull point system where they effectively had wounds, like witches with haywire grenades. Oh yes, we're just going to hit you with as many haywire grenades as we have witches, and they're like 1 point a model.
Yeah.
Get glanced to death, idiot.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it was, I mean, tanks were And it's funny because back then people were also spamming tanks, so it was like you had to take that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But yeah, I like the change to toughness. I think it makes it simpler and it doesn't really change anything. It doesn't really make a tank less tough because there were those times where, like you said, you'd get one-shotted by something and your tank felt like paper. But on the other hand, if you go against a certain opponent that maybe has no anti-tank, it's like, well, they're not having fun. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's just better
Um,
for everybody, in my opinion.
I do think there is a place for something like variable weapon skill though. And that sounds crazy, but
Makes sense to
it's
me.
it's well, okay, but we're both old, so like to a modern player, they would be, what are you talking about? Like that's so like what do you mean I have to consult a table? What do you mean I have to like count up one or two to find out the number that I hit on? Um but it's good because like uh variability in these stats creates like an interesting story. A perfect example is as I mentioned, like one of my friends like played Grey Knights. At the time in third edition, they all had weapon skill 5, which is one higher than the typical Marine. What ended up happening is that I played Space Wolves. I really liked Blood Claws because they had cool chainsaw swords and stuff. They were like the melee guys. Um, what ended up happening though is because Space Wolves are kind of weird. They have their scout equivalent is Blood Claws. They have their Space Wolf scouts, but they're considered more elite. To represent this, Blood Claws had weapon skill and ballistic skill 3, which is the equivalent of like normal humans. And this makes a lot of sense because if you actually like read the lore, um, Fenris is a backwards barbarian planet. Basically, think 1000 AD, like the Dane's Law. Like they are literally just Vikings. Um, and the concept of this strange talisman that belches fire and just kills things is like so beyond them, and they have to train all of that superstition out of them. Like they're not gonna fucking get that for like 20 years. Are you kidding me? Like they're dumb. Um, and so as a result, and I forget if it capped at 5 or not, but I would like have a million attacks, and it felt like orcs because I would just never be able to hit him. It's like the Goku Ultra Instinct, like they're just like walking slowly, like ducking under like my like wide swing and just like grabbing my head and like slamming me into the dirt. It's like it was that one-sided like every time.
Yeah, absolutely, man. That's funny that you say that because I remember Grey Knights being an absolute monster in certain editions way back
That
because of that weapon skill 5, because they hit everything on threes pretty much except for like characters, and like most armies needed to hit them on at best 4 plus, at best, and that's like Marines and like Eldar and like other elite stuff. It was tough.
Yeah. And also like the meta of I back up 6 inches and fire my storm bolters.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
Because
because they were assault too, and you didn't have to worry about having your own range for rapid fire, so you could just fire the full 24 at all times. That was fun.
yeah, and for those of you who are not in the know, there was also no running rules in the early edition. So everyone every infantry unit moved a static 6 inches. So what you would do is you would buy an upgrade from the armory called a targeter. And it was only 1 point, but it gave you the unique ability of being able to pre-measure for shooting. So you would make sure that you were exactly 13 inches away from your opponent. And then you would back up and fire your storm bolters because the way charge ranges worked um, was that you would only charge like 6 inches, identical to your movement. So there was no way, except for like very specific armies like Adepta Sororitas or Sisters of Battle at the time, or World Eaters. Their units in the Chaos Space Marine Codex would have the Rage rule, and this was one of the very few exceptions to the 6-inch movement rule, which I will, and that's another thing that modern 40k does really well is as someone who played Warhammer Fantasy Battle and Warhammer 40,000, the idea that all of these different units had the exact same movement rates to me was mind-boggling.
Yeah. Except if you were
Uh,
Eldar and then you had Fleet of Foot.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like there were like, and this is kind of goes back to that less is more mentality, right? Um Eldar felt so cool because they had the unique rule break. They could do fleet of foot. They could uh move and run and charge, and it made them feel very threatening despite the fact that they were so frail. Because if you just tried to approach Eldar, you would get countercharged like 110% of the time. And even if that unit wasn't necessarily like better than you in melee, the fact that they would hit first due to their higher initiative often meant that they would cripple your offense before you got a chance to fight them.
Yeah, you had to tackle Eldar in a very specific way to be able to beat them. And that's what made them very hated by players who didn't play a ton, your casual war gamer at your local game store, because when they charged in, they expected to fully kill the unit. And then when you had to tell them, no, 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 I'm initiative 6, I'm initiative 5, I strike first, and then you end up killing them, that made people salty, for sure.
And and don't get me wrong, you had a couple people that were like, you're playing third edition, and they're like, "Oh yes, I brought out my printed off data sheet of the solitaire from second edition. Even though it's only 70 points, it has all these like ridiculous stats. Trust me, we're totally like playing a fair game here."
Yeah, I have a story about that actually that's pretty funny. Not with the solitaire, but this fellow used to come into the local game store that I played at, and he would have his own kind of printed out, because there used to be like a custom, some sort of custom thing GW came up with for making characters, and I can't remember whether it came out in White Dwarf or one of their like really early like editions when they were talking about it.
Oh,
Do you
yes.
remember
So
that?
this was on the old website, and yeah, so they would have like events where they would provide like different resources that would work in Flash. I remember there was one, not to interrupt too much,
Hmm.
but there was one that was like horrors from the silver screen. And what it was is because GW used to be or Citadel used to be like the company that made like Dungeons and Dragons models, right? They would set up rules for you to kit bash. And I think they did this event twice. And you would make your monster, and you would have like a point buy of like different rules you could give them to be like, you could give them like the avatars, like uh, heat immunity rule. So they'd be immune to like flamers and stuff like that. And so they had like a points cost listed for all of them. And you would make your own monsters, kit bash them, and then like play them against other people at your store. And this was stuff that like it was either like a primitive version of like Warhammer community that used to put out these articles, or it was the Black Gobbo e-magazine.
Yeah,
Sorry.
interesting. No, no, no. I didn't know that, but that's interesting because that's exactly what he would bring to the local game store and play people with. And I remember after a while, like people stopped playing against him, and I was like always curious as to why. And a couple of the guys said, "Well, it's because he makes up his own rules." And we're like, "What do you mean he makes up his own rules? How can somebody make up their own rules?" And he's like, "Well, he's using rules from, and I think they said it was White Dwarf or something like that, but it could have been even before that, like you said. And what he's doing is his characters are custom characters." And I was like, "It can't be that bad, right?" It was that bad. It was that bad. He had a character that always struck first, initiative 10. He had, ignores armor on his attacks. He had all this stuff, right? But he forgot one thing, which was immunity to instant death. And I remember the funniest thing was I was playing this guy, and this character had must have killed like 300 points worth of models already. And I'm sitting there with a Wraith Lord and a Bright Lance, and I'm like, well, I'll shoot him with a Bright Lance because he's the last man in the unit. And he was like, okay. He has a 3-up invul save, and I'm like, all right. So he fails the 3-up invul, and then I'm like, he's probably immune to instant death or something, right? And he was like, I was like, check your list, man, because he had all the rules of the character written down on his list. He forgot to give him immunity to instant death, dead in one shot. I was laughing so hard, and everybody in the store that was watching the game was like busting out laughing, and like he was so embarrassed, and you could tell the reason he brought that character was to just clown on everybody, just destroy everybody. But he forgot the one thing that was going to keep him alive.
Yeah, and I do think that was like a very common story of like you'd run into people that would either like soft or hard cheat, and like in
Hmm.
reality they're very much like very what's the word, like low self-esteem, like this is like the thing they do that like they want
Right.
to like feel better about themselves, and it's like it is unfortunate on some levels. On the other hand, like it is good to like haha gotcha.
Yeah, I
um
mean, looking back, it was like, well, that's, unfortunate for him that he had to,
yeah.
kind of go through whatever he was going through. Warhammer being that thing that he kind of was latching onto. And I mean, there's so many stories of that. But yeah, there is an aspect to that I think people are afraid of when whenever we talk about custom rules or like that's where the fear is coming from, because a lot of the old timers remember that time in Warhammer. But it's not going to be like that. I think what people need to realize is that these are going to be more balanced with, kind of a modern perspective. Whenever I make a video about a new detachment or a custom detachment or whatever it is that I'm like, kind of spitballing ideas for, it's all with the current rule set in mind. Like it's all with balance in mind. And I think like the same could be said of anybody doing the same thing, custom rules, custom campaigns, custom missions for Warhammer 40K. I think there definitely should be a forum for that too, because, it's fun. Bottom line is it's fun and it gives power to the player as far as what they want to run in their army.
Yeah. And I think like the important thing is like try it out with like your local group. Like if you're anything like me, we have a bunch of people who like we'll play at like either like a local game store, or we have like a couple friends who have like their own table at their home. Um that seems like the best place to introduce that. As long as you have like a few people you play with like locally. Think of it in the same way as you would with like an actual like a Dungeons and Dragons group, right? Like, hey guys, I have like this interesting homebrew. I'm like trying to create some of my own thing. Would any of you be interested in playing like a friendly game and trying to help me like what feels broken, what feels fun to play against, what feels uninteractive, and sort of like think of it like you're problem solving as you go. You're not necessarily writing your rules, trying to play it as hard as you can. Like at the end of the day, like this is something you should be doing with your friends to have fun and to make the game more fun for everyone. Not to play against Timmy at the store and convince him that oh yeah, this is totally like real rules that I got from like a GW errata, and and then make him feel sad, right? Like no one wants to do that. And I think that in some ways that sort of lifeboat scenario is why GW designs certain things the way that they do. Um, a good example is that like Slanesh demons used to have a rule where they could manipulate the movement of your opponent's models to pull them towards you a couple inches. And I think that there were a couple cases where the Slanesh player, like the opposing player might have like moved the model for the opponent, and the like obviously Warhammer models are something that we all spend a lot of like a great deal of time on. I was actually just playing the other day, and someone who was trying to help his friend, my opponent, clean up after the game, lifted up a ruin off of the table that one of my obliterators was still on, and it fell to the floor. Thankfully, it was like the best possible model he could have picked up and dropped because those things are rock solid. Um,
The old
but it ended up,
obliterators? Yeah.
well, not the old ones, but they're the plastic ones, but
Ah.
there's so many pieces that are like very solidly put together. It sort of fell right on its little like plasma gun thing that had teeth on it, and it sort of like bent a couple of teeth, but nothing broke.
Hmm.
So not the worst thing in the world, but it was a frustrating experience. So I definitely understand like, or Magic the Gathering has like a card called Mindslaver where you're able to like play your opponent's deck for a turn.
Hmm.
And you can find ways to like loop that. It's a win condition. But that is also kind of like a no-no card because people pay like thousands of dollars for certain Magic cards. So do you really want someone putting their grubby hands all over your investment,
Hmm.
essentially? Um, but I think that, that GW essentially writes rules in fear of big fat evil Spike Neckbeard, abusing poor Timmy's like fluffy army and just like using math to oppress him. And they just have this like horror like lifeboat scenario, as I said, in their head when they're designing a lot of things. And it's like they're trying to they're so afraid of that situation that is like sub 1% of 1%, that they are afraid to get creative, and I think that's very unfortunate.
Yeah, for sure. And they're probably also a little bit afraid of people abusing certain things in tournaments, which, because Warhammer tournaments are becoming more popular, I assume GW thinks it's going to be a revenue stream soon, being able to, stream tournaments. I'm sure they're planning on doing something like that, right? I mean, they already have, a huge tournament scene, GW sponsored tournament scene, and I think they're going to try to move more mainstream with a lot of their stuff. But, regardless of how that shakes out, I think they are missing something and they are taking something away from the hobby by restricting these rules and making them flavorless, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Um, let's see. Oh my God. Sorry. I told someone I was in an interview. No, give me a few. That I was in an interview, and I think they thought it was a job interview.
Oh,
So I'm like having to quickly explain to them what happened. And yeah, and it's I just think that as someone who plays like, fighting games competitively and has played like several shooters on like a not quite a top 100 level, but I've traveled and actually like won money for events. I will definitely say that the money I've won for events is much lower than the like money I've put into travel, but I mean it's still saying something, right? That if you make a game fun, the community will create its own rule set to make it competitive. And I don't think that GW should necessarily obsess over making things hyper competitive all the time and keeping things 100% within their own hands. Um, because if you just give the players the tools and you make the game fun, players will make it competitive. Like look at Super Smash Bros. Melee. That game is broken on a fundamental level, and yet, over 20 years into its like lifespan, um, three characters that have never won a major, have won a major. I believe both Captain Falcon, Pikachu, and Donkey Kong have all won a major in like the last like 3 or 4 years. Um, which is like two of those characters were considered like unviable for tournament play forever.
yeah.
Um, and it's like if you push something hard enough, you will eventually find a niche. Like obviously, Warhammer is not a game with the same level of like skill expression as that. Um, but when you have like stuff like the old armory, I think as much as I am like a some of the modern design is really good. I think for example the armory and the level of like weapon customization, um, those were good things because they allowed you to make many different units and many different characters that felt very different. even if not all of those options were created equal. And I think that they create excellent opportunities for both Timmy, the casual player, to use his favorite things and to have a very like fun and fluffy unit. And then they also create interesting opportunities for Spike, the tournament player. Um, and I think that GW needs to let the community um do some of the legwork on the balance, and not necessarily like in some ways it feels like there's too many cooks in the kitchen, or that it's like a helicopter parent. That's a good example.
Yeah,
um
great example.
they
Yeah.
they want to dictate how to balance things, but I'm sure there were people on the GW balance team who play the game. Like, I'm not going to be as hyperbolic as to say like, oh well, but I am sure there are also people, like many of these people are probably salaried, they're busy, they have to go in on weekends. It's tough being an adult. You old heads are not going to put in the same number of reps as the guy who's like 18, 20, like in college, spending all of his parents' money on Warhammer and wants to be like the best Warhammer player. And, is like, you're not going to have that same level of like intimate knowledge, no matter how much you love Warhammer. You are a 9 to 5 old head. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there are people on the design team who play obviously, right? Even competitively. But like they're not going to be putting in the same amount of time and on the same, kind of talking about the same thing, but when you're looking at data, it's and you're not looking at the specific games that they were played in and so forth, and you're not looking at a bunch of different factors. It's very one dimensional, you know? And that's
And
how a
I
lot of
think
the balance is done.
exactly. And I think that's it, is that you're missing context for why that thing is bad, or that thing is less oppressive than it seems. And I feel like and again, you see this all the time at like tournaments. Like there's the new meme that's like, "Oh yeah, like I only play scissors, Scissors Nation." And it's like, wow, another fucking rock user trying to like ruin the game for everyone. Man, these kids just don't get it today. Like it's all like, they just want to play rock. Like they don't get it like we used to. And it's like I don't know if you've seen that. I can probably like find it and post it later, but oh man, that's such a good analogy for people that refuse to learn to adapt to changes in the metagame and just want to get mad about how things aren't the way that it used to be. And like it's not even just like in a boomer sense, but like in a sense that like I can't just like brainlessly like bulldoze this problem like I used to be able to, and I have to put in effort to think. And because I have to think, I'm mad.
Right. Well, the funny thing is, ironically, is I've gotten some comments over the well, not over the years, but over the last probably 6 months from disgruntled Eldar players who are like, man, like Eldar suck. Eldar suck now, man. They're horrible. Like, and it's like, well, at the beginning of the edition, they were really quite broken. And you couldn't really fail with them if you were running the tournament lists with the Wraith Knights and everything. You just couldn't lose, you know. So yeah, like I think they're fine, but competitively speaking, but people are really how do I say this without insulting people? They don't want to put effort into actually creating new strategies and tactics for things, and they don't want to adapt. And I think that's just human nature. You don't want to adapt. It's like the same thing in video games. Like I used to play a lot of League of Legends. I was talking to you about it earlier. Um, People when a certain champion got nerfed, people didn't want to play it anymore. It was almost like, well, time to move on to the next OP thing, and this champion just sucks now, right? Instead of like learning how to adapt to the changes. And I think that's the way people are in general, unfortunately.
And I think that's sort of like a problem with like gaming culture. Like just been a huge shift there where it's people and again it's like you have like the advent of like streaming and wanting to like be the best so that you can like quote unquote prove yourself. This is also like a you so there's like the Magic the Gathering infographics, and it's like Spike is like the tournament player who wants to like have all the best like advantages. It's not just that. Spike can also just want to prove himself in some ways. And I mean, like there's some exceptions to this, but this is a behavior that is like pervasive throughout all sorts of games. Another great example is World of Warcraft Classic had this problem where it's like people want to like dungeon boost, they don't want to play the game like quote unquote like properly,
Hmm.
and they want to like find ways to exploit the system in order to like uh, even if it's only like reducing like their playtime down by like uh, a couple of hours in like the grand scheme of things. Because like when you factor in all the times of like waiting for a boost, getting the money for a boost, like is it really that much worse than just like
Yeah.
playing the game normally?
It's funny that you
Um,
mentioned that because I remember when vanilla or classic WoW came out, and I hopped on the bandwagon. I was playing. I was trying to grind to Grandmaster PvP, and I remember getting this message from somebody saying, "Hey man, I've noticed you in a lot of battlegrounds and stuff like that. Like, are you in one of the discords for battlegrounds for Alterock Valley?" And I was like, what are you talking about?" And he was like, "Oh, you didn't know? Everybody's in discords with each other, queuing at the same time, so they can get pre-made, like pseudo pre-made groups, so they can smash Alterock Valley like over and over again, grinding for Grandmaster." And I was like,
yeah,
dude,
we're all just colluding for an advantage.
right, exactly. I was like, I can't believe they're fucking doing that. Yeah, it was stupid. And
Yeah,
he
and
was trying to like get into one of these pre-made groups, and I was like, no, I'm not part of it.
yeah. And yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And there's all sorts of like ways that like I don't know what it is. Like people have gotten really lazy and are just looking for like shortcuts.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean like you see this like there's so many like League of Legends tournaments where you find out like oh such and such team got caught using like a hardware advantage, and it's like the only penalty is like a decrease to their prize pool. Like they don't necessarily like always like ban them outright. Like they'll like red card that player and then someone will get tagged out to substitute for them. Um and I don't follow League that closely. So I mean I'm sure there could have been like things to change this, but it seems like there's a lot of organizations are reluctant to punish players harshly, and so it incentivizes like trying to get away with what you can in some ways.
Right.
And so it has bred this like mentality of if it gives me an advantage, I should do it, and the only downside is if I get caught.
Right. I mean, look at the Warhammer 40K scene in the last, what, year or so, when you've had people, I mean, I'm not talking about hard cheating, but, soft cheating, basically counting things as what they shouldn't be, telling players, "Oh, I'm toughness 6 versus toughness 5," or, you know, um, my, what was it, that stupid controversy where that guy's Storm Raven was like half an inch above what it should have been, or half a millimeter, whatever it was, so that you couldn't charge it or something like that, you couldn't engage it in combat. Just weird shit like that, where people are doing things like that and trying to get away with it, and then of course getting punished for it when they get caught you know
And I do think that's an interesting point because I feel like there's also been a huge increase in like straight up hard cheating. Like obviously we have like the toilet dice fiasco. I'm willing to cut the Storm Raven player a little bit of slack because it's like when you're modeling some of these things and you're talking about like an exactness of
Hmm.
like inches, I feel like maybe there was some due diligence on his end where he should have like known how high the model is supposed to be on that. But it's one of those things where it's like that seems believable enough when you're talking like hundredths of an inch. Like
Yeah,
it's
honest
hard to prove
mistake.
intention for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it could have been an honest,
um
or just, models are sometimes cast differently, and maybe it has a slightly, impacted flight stand indent. Who knows?
yeah. So like that's one that's like okay, whatever. But like stuff like the like straight up using loaded dice, I feel like we're actually seeing a huge increase in like hard cheating, or at least that it's getting caught more.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. Well, back in the day, it would never get caught. I remember several times going to tournaments and there'd be accusations of loaded dice and stuff like this. And I've played games against people, at events back in fifth edition where I believed they were using loaded dice for the first turn for the who gets the first turn roll,
mhm.
because it was obvious they would pick out a specific dice and they would roll it and it would roll a six. How, you know? And I've talked to other players and they had similar experiences, and it's like, but how do you catch that player once it's all said and done? It's very easy to just swap out that dice with another one that's not weighted and just say, hey, look, it rolled a two. It must not be weighted. But people are getting caught nowadays because there's more vigilance about it. The judges are more vigilant about that kind of thing. Back then, I don't think they were that invested, to be honest.
And I think people have like thought through some of those problems and understand like because it's like, did the average player actually understand like the different ways a loaded dice can be created? Not necessarily, and there's different ways you can test for it. Because you got to think like there were a lot more kids playing Warhammer back then too. Um, and it's like now it's like I won't say that there aren't children, but you have a lot of people who are um have been in the shoes of that person and have sat there and thought through, well, how could I prove that? For example, with like the loaded dice thing, I would literally um force them to roll out all of their dice one at a time and just sit there with like a pen and paper, and I would get like a judge to sit there with me. And I'm like, we're gonna brute force this, you and me, and I'm going to prove that you're cheating. Like, I do not care. Like, I would rather not be able to finish the event, out you as a cheater, and have you never attend an event again. That is like beyond petty.
Yeah, that's
And
horrible.
I do think you run into the opposite a little bit, where it's I have seen TOs who are sort of like will, I won't say collude, but they will sort of give a slap on the wrist to people that they know personally,
Hmm.
and I think that that is a very serious problem, especially at like RTT level stuff.
Yep, I ran into
Um,
that all the time when I was a kid.
mhm.
All the time. Because, the adults, they knew each other, they hung out, they played games with each other, and it was like, you couldn't really. You couldn't really expect that any ruling would go your way, even if GW specifically said, yes, this is how it works.
Yeah, and it's so like, and you run into that like at fighting games too, where it's like, I've had this happen at a melee event where a TO basically put a clause in the rule set that's like, yeah, so we can change things like on the dime. And so what I did is there's a technique, a stalling technique called pound stalling with Jigglypuff in Super Smash Bros. Melee. You can sort of like run down the clock, and the TOs got a little bit lazy. They said, we're using this rule set from like this tournament with like these caveats, and they did not include a clause for pound stalling. And so it wasn't even me, but there was a friend of mine, Macho Man Sam, and he is he's a little bit like scummier than even I am in certain like fighting games, like willing to like, exploit people's emotions and like frustrate them into making mistakes.
Right.
Um, which is like that sounds to war gamers, that sounds like awful. Um, but it is like at the fighting game community is a little bit more rough and tumble, I'll
It's
say.
also more common at the video game, yeah, fighting game community for sure.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Um, and so like as a result, the TO basically like put the game on hold, said like, oh, don't worry, buddy, to like his friend who's like getting stalled out, and it's just like, yeah, you can't do that anymore. It's like, the fuck do you mean I can't do this anymore? It's literally not in the rules. Like I'm allowed to use this. Like even though we're like labbing the rule set, that's on them. So I don't know. It is a little bit frustrating. You run into that sometimes where it's like there's like this misplaced sense of fairness. I think. Where it's like they have this idea of like things being like perfectly fair, and what it really is it's if you have a skill set that is like, I'll say, non-standard, like understanding opponent, like your opponent's psychology and being able to like manipulate that. Um, it's like the what is like the sci-fi story where it's like smart people have like noise machines tied to their head, and like, strong people have weights tied to them to sort of like bring everyone to the same level of equal outcome. I'm blanking on what it is, but you might know.
I know what you're talking about, but I'm not familiar with the
It,
reference.
it okay, well, someone in the comments will know, I'm sure. Um, but yeah, I definitely think that there is a lot of like ways that the rules can be structured to be more interesting with even like minimal input. Um, and I would challenge a lot of the viewers out there to take some of the like data sheets from indexes that are like unplayably bad. The Chaos Sorcerer, or like the Shadow Seer, or things like that. Find a way, a fun, flavorful rule, and repoint it and post it in the comments. And I want to see what you all can come up with. um and I'm sure like help me out with like knights, for example. Or even, what is your army's fantasy? How should your army play to be most in line with their lore? And I think, for example, Imperial Guard is often what is the word? They are flanderized as a defensive army. And I think that this first started in the Dawn of War series, where they really wanted to garrison units inside of their different buildings and they could fire out. And I think that's very cool, but I think what has happened is that people who played those games took that identity from the games and have applied it to the army. And I think guard should almost, in an ideal world, play like orcs. They should want to run forward with like waves of human infantry, back them up with tanks, um, and like be encouraged to be aggressive. And you saw a little bit of that in ninth edition. And I think that's why so many guard players loved ninth edition, is that they were incentivized to go forward. Um, Even if the army wasn't as hordy as before, it felt very engaging because you had a lot of these like tactical utility switches that you could pull on people. I also think that people overreacted to the Scion bomb, because when you actually go back and look at the actual like tournaments that Guard were winning, they had a lot of like top finishes, but didn't quite necessarily get the win. And I think that's a good way to understand that the army is not like broken. They have a lot of things that make them very consistently strong, and have individual tools that certain top tier factions might have struggled to deal with. But overall, other armies were really good, and had tools to deal with it. And I think if the edition had gone on a little bit longer, Guard would have actually gone back down to like a sane win rate, like that healthy 45 to 55% win rate.
Yep.
And I think that again just sort of ties back into GW. Give things time to breathe. You don't necessarily always have to hyper react to something that is strong. Um I think, for example, Sisters kind of got knee jerk reaction. They say they want to deal with like the what are they called?
Miracle
Faith
dice.
dice? Yeah, miracle dice. And I'm afraid for that, because I think that mechanic is very fluffy for them. And I understand that, like, yes, being dice in a dice game is problematic. However, in the case of Sisters, where they have to have units die to gain that, it's a little bit more fair, because you don't start with them front loaded. And I think that the ninth edition version, for example, of the Eldar Fate dice was a lot more fair, because every single dice you got was impactful. It wasn't always necessarily the thing you needed. And as a result, you had to sort of make the best with what you have, and so it kept the Eldar game plan fluid. It didn't devolve into, yes, I got X number of like fives and sixes GG's other person, like it was in like the beginning of 10th. And there were obviously other things that fed into that. Um, but it's I feel like in some ways Eldar has become a much more rigid army.
Yeah. Yeah, I would prefer the return of the old system of fate dice, personally.
Well, I mean, even something like battle focus, right? Like we're seeing a lot of these very we're seeing a lot of like mech Eldar, Fish of Fury style lists. But I mean, I think that like the defining uh traits of Eldar as an army are mobility and psychic slash utility. Um, and I think that those are when people think of Eldar, those are the two things they think of. If you think of like the Dawn of War video game, you have fleet of foot. You lose accuracy, but you move faster. And in a RTS game, being able to just toggle increased movement rate it is a pretty broken ability. I don't personally recall the Dawn of War meta, but you know, it's
Yeah,
pretty good.
it was unbelievably good in Dawn of War. It was great, but yeah, totally agree. Totally agree with you. Well,
Yeah.
let's say this. You're pretty active on the Discord. Anybody who wants to join the channel Discord can do so. You just have to sign up for a Patreon free trial. It's something you can cancel totally free and then join the Discord. I'm going to create a channel for custom rule sets for different units, armies, and stuff like that you guys can brainstorm. So not only in the comments, but if you want to kind of take this to, a further step, you can join the Discord and have conversations with me, with Taxi, with a lot of other Eldar players that love, creating lore-based rules and stuff like that for their factions. And eventually we can compile maybe kind of like a supplement to the game that has all these custom data sheets in it for different units that you want to swap out for the regular data sheets in your index.
A community rebalance
Yeah,
document.
there we go. That's exactly what it'd be. And that I think be a
Alrighty,
really cool thing.
alrighty, Proxy. Well, thank you so much for having me. I super appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on and talking about this. It's been awesome.
Alrighty, have a great day.
All right. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.
Bye.